One can spot the secret police by their body language. Some you can spot because they are simply poor actors. They wear the wrong clothes, have the wrong haircut, and speak as though they were reading their lines. However, those that are professional and can get at least the externals correct are then betrayed by the unconscious expressions of their body. The martial arts teach one to become much more aware of body movement. Before beginning martial arts training, I judged people on how they looked and what they said. Now I judge them by how they move. I find this a more accurate indicator since, though the other two can be faked, only a master of self-control could fake the way they moved. Movement expresses the basic internal dynamics of a person's character. If a person walks as though he's got his thumb up his ass, he usually does. It is difficult to specify exactly what it is about a person's movements. Like trying to describe the smell of fried bacon. It is an experience. Bacon smells like bacon. Frightened people move like frightened people. Confident people move like confident people. Every internal feeling and thought can express itself through movement, and this movement can be recognized. My minor talent in reading body language came in handy when, on occasion, I would act as a lookout and muscle for a small-time local pot dealer in Taipei. Taiwan was a police state. For 42 years, the island had been under martial law, ensuring that the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, maintained absolute power. Taiwan's police force is probably the best trained and most professional force in Asia. Even though Taiwan was a police state, one never had the impression that there were many police around. In the best tradition of Chinese subtlety, the police monitored everything without making their presence obvious. It is not until after living there for a while that one begins to recognize where the police are. Less than half are in uniform. The rest blend in with the general population. The cook at the corner noodle stand, the vendor selling newspapers, the high school student carrying books, the doorman sitting in the open lobby of an apartment building, all could be undercover police. Filling in the cracks of government surveillance was a community watch informant program that enlisted maybe 15% of the population to report on anything unusual. Taipei was a city with many eyes and ears and very few secrets. I had been in Taiwan for about 2 months, and after purchasing a motorcycle, I spent the better part of each evening hanging out in the American red light district known as Sugar Daddy Row. It was raining as usual, and so I headed for the Shaolin Pub, a small pub run by 2 former hostess girls, Wendy and Angel. It had an intimate and subdued atmosphere, and also being located in the middle of Sugar Daddy Row, it was the ideal staging grounds for another night of unbridled debauchery. I parked my motorcycle in one of the back alleys. On the way, I passed several hostess bars, which I never visited. I had been to a couple while in Hong Kong, and I knew that the cost of drinks was way out of my budget. Another financial hazard was that should you get horny enough to want to buy out one of the girls, it could cost you a month's pay. When it came to hostess bars, I felt discretion was the better part of honor. Stationed outside these bars were barkers, elderly gentlemen who had been peddling poontang to American GIs since the Korean War. Now their clientele consisted mostly of German engineers and American importers. They would sit on their stools in front of the girly clubs, gossiping and smoking cigarettes. Whenever a foreigner would pass by, they would jump up and say, "Hey, Mr. American, you like beautiful girl? Come for only 1 drink, please." This was followed by a dramatic bow with one arm extended out towards the entrance. I passed by these old boys hundreds of times, and though I never went in, they still jumped up with arm extended every time I walked by. Ahead of me was a group of Chinese middle managers for some plastics, electronics, or export company. Dressed in gray suits with ties loosened and collars undone, they walked with a confidence they didn't really feel. They would all pretend to be gregarious, which is not easy in a culture where you are taught from infancy that the nail that stands out gets hammered. But the Western disease of ego had infected even this far corner of the world. The effects of hundreds of Hollywood movies has instilled the idea that they should all be somehow making more noise and having more fun. How exactly all this fun was to be had was unclear. "Look," one would say, "I have a funny way of drinking my beer." "Terrific," the others would chime in, and everyone would laugh harder than the joke deserved. Usually they would play drinking games until they were too drunk to come up with any more lame jokes. Then, piling into a taxi, they would disappear into the fog. There was only a small neon sign to indicate the entrance to the Shaolin Pub, and lost amongst the cacophony of neon, it was easy to overlook. Wendy was the first to greet me as I walked in. She was the older of the two hostesses, but also had the largest bust. She would lean over the bar, pressing her arms together so that her breasts would bulge out of the invariably low-cut dress, and ask in a Marilyn Monroe-like voice, "Hi, boys. See anything you like?" She would flutter her impossibly large eyelashes and smile. Even the dullest accountant was able to spot the opening for a one-liner, which was always, "Yeah, baby, I see a couple of things I like." Wendy would pretend to not understand for a moment. Then, looking down at her breasts, she would say in feigned embarrassment, "Oh, you so bad." How many hundreds of times Wendy must have played this little skit, I can only guess. Yet it always succeeded in giving even the most boring of clerks the feeling that they were witty. The first time she tried that skit on me, I knew the setup was too obvious. When the question was asked, I replied with, "Gee, I don't know, but if you'll drop your pants and bend over the bar, I might be able to come up with something." "Oh, you are really a bad man," Wendy replied. After that, we had an unspoken understanding. She wouldn't play me for a fool tourist, and I would tip big and drool appreciatively at her charms. I spotted a Filipino man sitting at the bar talking to an Australian businessman, tie loosened, jacket hanging from the chair. My instincts told me he was a pot smoker. Scoring in a strange country under martial law is a delicate matter. It takes time to find out who are the players, and when you can't speak the language, it takes even longer. I had scored some grass from one of the hostess girls I had picked up 2 weeks earlier. She was, however, flaky, and she could only provide small amounts. I always try to find several sources, since at any time one source could dry up and leave you stuck and having to go through the long ordeal of making new connections again. I sat down beside the two men at the bar to listen to the conversation. They were making small talk, and I gathered they had only just met and were exchanging pleasantries. They quickly reached the point where the conversation petered out, and there was a silence, each turning their chairs around to survey the rest of the bar. I was already turned around, and as he turned around, he was forced to look directly at me. He raised his glass in salute and said, "Cheers." He drank a swig. I did the same. "Edgar," he said. "Smack," said I. There was a pause as we both looked out at the bar. Wendy's too perfect to be real breasts caught our attention as she walked among the tables, joking in a naughty manner with the patrons who were mostly businessmen taking advantage of the happy hour. I guessed Edgar was Filipino when I first saw him. I decided to use one of the dirty phrases in Tagalog I had learned from a Filipino busboy I had worked with at the airport strip in Toronto. Malaki ang titi ko? Which means, do you have a big prick? I asked as though asking for the time of day. Edgar was momentarily stunned. Did he hear correctly? Did the big guilo really ask about the size of his prick in his native tongue? His eyes widened in shock. I could see the thoughts passing through his head. Was I a queer? Was I picking a fight? Or was I some asshole with a sick sense of humor? I saw a mischievous glimmer in his eye. He had guessed correctly. "Buotangina mo," he replied in Tagalog, drawing out the vowels in a musical rendition. I knew that phrase too. Fuck your mother. "Right after I'm done with yours," I said in English this time. I raised my beer in a toast. I knew I was pushing the edge and he might still take a swing at me. "Boy, you really are an asshole," said Edgar, tapping his beer against mine in salute. "I know, it's a gift," I said humbly. I wasted no time getting to the point. "So, Edgar, where can I buy some ganja?" Edgar looked shocked again. Was I some new kind of undercover policeman? A Caucasian narc? "What are you, a cop or something?" "Yeah, right. Like I'm going to tell you if I was." I called Wendy over. "Edgar thinks I'm a cop." "Wow, you crazy. This is Mr. Smacky. He is English teacher from Canada," said Wendy in a serious voice. My credentials established, Edgar relaxed. We finished our beers and Edgar motioned me to follow him. We went out of the bar and up another flight of stairs into what was an office that seemed to be deserted and undergoing renovations. He took out a small knife and punched some holes into the side of a beer can he had brought from the bar. We sat on the floor in the dark, bathed in the cool neon light that came through the windows, and smoked a large chunk of black hash from the beer can. Edgar asked me how I guessed he was holding. "I spotted you the minute I walked in." "So you sit down beside me and start talking to me just so that you could get stoned?" "Yes, and I also thought you were cute," I said, fluttering my eyelids. "Boo!" Edgar trailed out the first vowel of the Tagalog phrase that ended with, "your mother." "Boo!" I countered. The Taipei drug culture was a small, intimate affair. Heavy drugs were virtually unknown on the island, and marijuana use was confined to a small group of Chinese entertainers, expatriates from Western countries, and a few overseas Chinese, those that had gone abroad to study or work and had picked up the habit there. Alcohol and drug abuse among the Chinese themselves was almost unheard of. Even though they had easy access to alcohol, young people almost never drank. The college beer parties and booze fests of Western higher education didn't happen here. The only drug that was occasionally abused were amphetamines, a habit that some picked up from the Japanese. But this was not used for recreation, but rather to improve one's productivity and as an aid for all-night studies preceding exams. Edgar supplied hash and marijuana to the expatriate community, only occasionally and reluctantly selling to Chinese, and even then only overseas Chinese. Dealing with locals meant not knowing whom you were dealing with. They could be gangsters looking to rip you off, or informants for the police. Either way, Edgar didn't bother with them. Edgar was from a small village on Luzon Island in the Philippines. He was about 25 when I first met him, a slim but well-proportioned 5'3", with more Spanish than Malayan features. He could pass as a native in both Madrid and Mexico. Like most Filipino men, Edgar sported a mustache to show his machismo. But Edgar had a baby face that gave one the impression that he was an adolescent who used a black marker on his lip to see what he'd look like when he got older. Instead of the menacing macho look Edgar desired, he came off as slightly comical. The bar girls would cuddle him and say, "Why, don't you look all manly with that nasty old mustache?" While Edgar blushed like a schoolboy. Unlike other Filipinos who were in the country on domestic work visas, Edgar had a diplomatic passport. This unusual privilege was afforded Edgar and his sister by his mother's sugar daddy, a Chinese diplomat who was stationed in the Philippines. Edgar's mother was his mistress there, and one of the favors he bestowed on her was to send her children, by a previous marriage, to Taipei. Edgar and his sister Martha lived in a comfortable apartment in an upscale but fashionable area of town. Edgar used his diplomatic pouch. His luggage was not allowed to be searched by customs officials. To smuggle hash in from the Philippines, where the cost was $5 an ounce, and sell them to the expatriates who were happy to find any drugs at all for up to $400 an ounce. This made Edgar popular among the expatriate community, which suited him fine since he preferred the company of Westerners to that of any Asians. It was on the few occasions when Edgar had a deal going with some overseas Chinese that he would ask me to come along and cover his back. I obliged, since from the day that I met him in the bar, Edgar had kept me supplied with all the hash I wanted and refused to accept any payment in return. When I'd offer money, it was always, "No, just buy me a beer." Somehow we had bonded. Perhaps it was my bravado and bizarre sense of humor. I think it impressed Edgar's Latino macho shit, which is how I referred to his sense of humor. Edgar was worried about being busted, not because of doing jail time — he had diplomatic immunity — but because he would be expelled from the country permanently. Taipei was his home. The Philippines held out no hope for him. In the Philippines, he would just be one more bastard son of a kept woman with not enough education to ever dream of finding a job. His best chance would be the slow death of menial labor or the quicker death of booze and drugs. In Taipei, Edgar, like the rest of us, could pass himself off as a prince among men. The anonymity provided freedom from his background. On the face of it, he was not bad off. He had a nice apartment, expenses paid for by Taiwan tax dollars. For transport, Edgar drove a sporty little scooter with a sleek white fairing, a hot pink banana seat, and pink lightning bolt decals. It was the height of fashion at the time. He made good money from his business, was well known and popular at all the clubs in town, and ran with a fast crowd of hookers, entertainers, and expatriates. Spending the rest of his life sniffing glue, sitting on the stoop with the chickens in a sweltering Manila ghetto was the stuff of nightmares. One of Edgar's overseas Chinese customer was a strange fellow who went by the name of Caesar. He ran a small nightclub located on the top floor of an office building in an industrial area of town. There was seldom any customers in the club, and one guessed that he had other sources of income, and the club was more of a rich kid's toy than a viable business venture. Details about his background were vague. The story was that he had gotten into some kind of trouble in the States, and his wealthy parents had exiled him back to Taiwan, believing that the conservative values and lifestyle of the homeland would rub off on their middle-aged son. It didn't. I had met Caesar before I met Edgar. At the time, a friend had informed me that a certain Chinese club owner was selling hash, and he arranged for me to meet him. I went to the club that occupied 2 suites on the top floor of an office building. The interior was reminiscent of a 60s-style coffee house with bare wooden floors, low coffee tables, and pillows to sit on. Above the bar was a badly painted mural of Jimi Hendrix playing guitar in Rainbow Heaven. The stereo system and record collection filled an entire wall. I sat at one of the small coffee tables and waited for Caesar to join me. After an hour, he sat down. "I'm here to see you about," I began. "Shush, don't say anything now." He looked around nervously and left. There were only 3 other people in the room, easily recognizable as American exchange students. 2 hours later, he returned. "In a few minutes, go upstairs. Wait until I'm gone. Don't say anything," Caesar whispered. The name of the club was The Bird's Nest, and its meaning became clear after I went upstairs. There, on the roof of the office building, was an old pigeon coop, about 8 feet by 10 feet, that was raised on posts so that one had to climb a small ladder to reach the door. Caesar had roughly converted it into his living quarters. It was a filthy, clotted affair with a small television, stereo system, coffee maker, and piles of clothes heaped into the corners. I wonder if he bothered to clean out the pigeon shit before laying the mattress on the floor. Pigeon feathers were still clinging to the rough wooden walls. This is where Caesar slept, after locking and bolting the heavy steel door that provided the only access to the roof. Here, in his little pigeon coop, he finally felt safe. "What are you so paranoid about?" I asked. "Hey, fuck you. You don't know these fucking Chinese. Secret police. Narcs, man. They're everywhere. Those fucking Chinese. You can never tell who's a narc." I thought it odd he would refer to his own race in the third person. Caesar was a short, pudgy man in his early 40s. He sported a heavy metal look, chains hanging from studded black leather belt, black metalhead t-shirt, and long black hair streaked with gray. He spoke English without an accent and had studied at Berkeley many years ago. After one last fearful glance through the cracks in the walls, he took out a small chunk of hash, wrapped in tinfoil, and handed it to me. "Would you mind if I smoke some before I go?" I asked. "No, not here." Caesar's face wrinkled up into the kind of face an old Chinese grandmother makes when she catches her grandson masturbating in his mother's bra. I guess his mother must have been a shrew from hell. "Look, I know you want to try some, so I already rolled you a spliff." Caesar pulled a thin joint from his jacket pocket and handed it to me furtively. "Just take this and smoke it once you get away from here." I thanked him and was grateful no further conversation was needed to get out of Caesar's paranoid pigeon coop. Finally, after so many hours, I was able to score some hash, but it was underweight and overpriced. I wasn't too fond of Caesar for that. And to make matters worse, he was also starting to make me feel paranoid. It was around 3 in the morning when I was finally on my bike again. I checked the streets for unmarked cars, but the area was deserted. I rode about 3 blocks away to get away from the bird's nest, and pulled into a dark and deserted alley to smoke that spliff. I turned off the bike to better hear any approaching cars, but it was silent. My tolerance had been down since supply was sporadic, and I would have to make 1/8 of an ounce of hash last a month. So the spliff did its work. Sitting in the dark alley in a deserted section of Taipei at 3 in the morning added considerably to the seed of paranoia Caesar had implanted. Back on Sugar Daddy Row, the night was still young, and the usual crowd will have moved from the Shaolin Pub to the Woodstock Disco. At that time of night, I could make it all the way across town in about 40 minutes, being able to employ all the advantages of two-wheel travel, such as driving along the sidewalks and scooting through red lights. I was making my way through old downtown, an area notorious for old-style gangsters, lots of karaoke bars and love hotels. Traffic was heavy, so I had to stop at a red light. A blue BMW pulled up beside me. There were 2 Chinese men inside the car, dressed in gray business suits. They appeared to be in their 40s. The window rolled down, and the man on the passenger side spoke to me in good English. Not overseas education, but the best local instructors could provide. Hi, are you American? Shit, here we go again. I thought the guy wants to practice his English during a red light. No, I'm Canadian. Oh, where from in Canada? Toronto. Toronto is a very good place. Why are you out so late? The hair on my neck began to stand up. This was not the type of question that a typical Chinese would ask. Since I was sitting higher up, I could only see the passengers. I bent down as if trying to come closer in order to hear better, but really so that I could also see the driver better. They both sat very erect. I'm sorry, what did you say? The driver looked very serious. The passenger was smiling, but his eyes betrayed a watchfulness. I said, you are out having a good time. Oh yeah, out with some friends. Where did you go tonight? Now I knew they were police. Buffalo Town. You know Buffalo Town? Buffalo Town was the name of a large disco and nightclub in a part of town well away from Caesar and the Bird's Nest, but also located on the road I was on so that it would jibe with my present location. Oh, Buffalo Town is very dangerous. Many gangsters and drugs there. I had only been there once, and didn't recall seeing either. Really? I didn't know that. The light turned green. They didn't move. The passenger and driver exchanged words. I guess they were deciding whether to pull me over and sniff me a new asshole. I had a small amount of hashish in my sock, a guaranteed ticket back to Hong Kong if I were busted. Okay, be careful driving home. Thanks, and same to you. I smiled brightly. I wondered if they had followed me from Caesar's. Nah, then they would have caught me in the lie and pulled me over for sure. No, they were just on patrol, and judging by his excellent English, they were the secret police. I began to wonder if Caesar's paranoia wasn't justified after all. I never had to score from Caesar again, and would be happy to have had nothing further to do with him, but for a rumor a few months later that Caesar was busted. The story goes that with the help of his parents' influence, he was able to avoid doing jail time. A few days later, he had called Edgar and ordered an unusually large amount of hash. Edgar quoted an enormous price, but Caesar didn't haggle. Edgar quickly put two and two together and asked me to be backup. He wasn't going to go through with the deal anyway, and Edgar made sure he had not a speck of incriminating evidence anywhere on his person or premises, but he wanted to see for himself if Caesar was acting as an informer. They had arranged to meet at the Shaolin Pub, our usual rendezvous, since, as Sun Tzu says, make the enemy fight on your ground. We had worked out a routine. Edgar would never carry anything when meeting his customers. He would stash the drugs disguised as garbage in one of the back alleys, and later, after receiving the money, they would stroll down the alley and retrieve the dope. I would arrive at the location ahead of time and scope out the area. No one outside our intimate circle of friends knew of my connection with Edgar, so I could watch anonymously from the surrounding crowd for any trouble. If there was trouble, I could move in unexpectedly from behind. The night of his meeting with Caesar, I arrived at the Shaolin early and took a stool at the end of the bar that afforded the best view of the pub. Things were quiet and nothing seemed out of place. About 15 minutes before the appointed time, 2 Chinese men in gray suits walked in. I had a complete view of their bodies as they walked in the door. They were secret police, a term approximating FBI and DEA rolled into one. Their walk was too confident, and they were too aware of their surroundings. Not polite Chinese behavior at all. The Chinese way is to exude an air of humility. Swaggering was not polite behavior, Being intensely aware of your surroundings was not polite behavior. The two policemen took seats at a table at the other end of the bar. They turned their chairs around and began scanning the room. I ignored them, pretending to be mesmerized by Wendy's antics behind the bar, but instead discreetly observed the scene and the reflection of the mirrored back wall. Basic spycraft. 5 minutes later, Caesar walked in. He appeared even more nervous and paranoid than usual. He looked everywhere except at the two Chinese men at the bar. That settled it. He was with them. The way he avoided looking in that direction was a giveaway. When I ordered my beer, I had quickly drank 2/3 of it and then let the bottle coast. This way, I could finish my beer and leave without looking as though I was in a sudden hurry. I was in a hurry since Edgar was scheduled to arrive any minute, and I needed to warn him before he got there. I finished the last bit of the bottle and said, "Well, I'm off. Gotta get back or else the wife will kill me," I joked to Wendy, who knew I had no wife. I went downstairs and onto the street. I stopped at the corner to light up a smoke and discreetly scanned the two streets for signs of Edgar and more police. There was a parked car across the street with heavily tinted windows. I tried to see if there were any people inside. Then someone must have lit a cigarette, and for a moment I could see a glow through the window. Edgar pulled around the corner on his white scooter. I caught his eye briefly and then turned and started walking away. That was our signal. Edgar kept driving without giving the club or me a second glance, and I continued down the 3 blocks to where my bike was stashed. I always parked 3 blocks away from the rendezvous point since, in case of a pursuit, it would be easier to lose pursuers through the tangle of alleys on foot and then backtrack later than risk the open streets on an identifiable motorcycle. We met at a prearranged second rendezvous. The Ploughmans, at the center of the Dinghao shopping district, was an English-style pub that served as the hangout for executive expatriates. Edgar had already gotten a booth in the back and had ordered 2 beers. "Smack, what happened?" I told him the story. "Fucking Caesar, that asshole. I knew he was trying to set me up. You see, you can't trust Chinese, even those overseas Chinese. They act like they're Americans, but they're still Chinese inside." "Well, there are assholes in every culture," I said. "Hey, I owe you another one." "Don't mention it." I waited a week before going back to Sugar Daddy Row. There were other areas to party in. I returned to the Shaolin and ordered a beer. Michelle, the other hostess, came over. "Hey, Smacky, how's life?" said Michelle, without any of the coquettishness of her partner Wendy. "The usual, non-stop fun and excitement. Nina?" "Oh, I have problem with my boyfriend. He always drink too much and play with other girls." I was close with Billy, her fiancé. He was a local television soap opera star who also ran his own nightclub in Dinghao. Since we were both born on the same day and year, and being both sardonic womanizers with a touch of manic depression and a death wish, we had bonded instantly. "Well, Billy is a handsome and charming boy. It's hard to fight off all those women all the time." "Yeah, I know, those bar girls all chase after him." "But don't worry, none of them are as beautiful as you." This was true. Michelle was in her early 30s with a sensuous face and well-endowed body. Drop-dead gorgeous. Michelle smiled and waved her hand at me, and then she took a slightly more serious tone. "I haven't seen your friend Edgar for a while. Is he all right?" "Yeah, he's fine. He's just been busy with some business elsewhere." "It's just as well he didn't come here for a while." "Why, something up?" "Last week 2 policemen come in here, and they waited around for Edgar to show, but he not come, so they show me his picture and ask if I know where he might be. I tell him he is only sometime customer, and I not see him for a long time." "Have they been back since?" No, but you never know when they will come back to look again. Thanks. Oh, it's nothing. No one liked police in Taiwan anyway. I left her a large tip. Edgar didn't get away entirely clean. His police file was getting thicker. There were cross-references with other known associates added. He was still safe. His stepfather's guanxi was good and would protect him from any real harm. However, political climates change, and men grow tired of their mistresses.